Okay, we're going to go ahead and look at English and French America. We've talked a little bit about the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire. Some of the things we talked about for them was that these were empires that were like really rich with mineral resources. The Spanish Empire had tons of gold, tons of silver. And because of that, the Spanish didn't really care if their government system was not necessarily democratic or if it wasn't necessarily the most cost-effective empire, because they could really afford to go ahead and have a very expensive bureaucracy. We also talked about the Portuguese. They were a little bit slower to develop the New World than the Spanish, because you might remember the Portuguese didn't find an advanced civilization with gold and silver. They were more interested in the things going on in Africa and India with their proven resources and proven wealth. But you should remember the Portuguese did, in fact, go ahead and establish wealth from sugar cultivation. Other big differences to remember before we go into England and New France. The Spanish and the Portuguese had a lot of intermarriage between different racial identities. You might remember that it was very common for white Spaniards to have relationships, marital relationships with Native Americans, creating a new group of people that become referred to as mestizos, or a mix between white European and Native Americans. We also know that with the importation of black slaves to the New World, primarily because Native American slaves died from the lack of immunity to smallpox, we see that Native Americans and whites also, black slaves and black freedmen and whites intermarried, creating a new class of people we call mulattoes. So total integration of different ethnic groups was very common in the Spanish Empire and in the Portuguese Empire. We'll look at some of the ways that's different with the English and then see how France sets itself up. So let's go ahead and look at English and French. So with that said, this is just a little bit of what the world looks like at the time. This map here is looking at one of the things that Europe is doing is they are transporting slaves across to the New World. If you look at the map in the very middle, you notice how it says the Middle Passage, and this is that passage connecting the African slave trade to the New World. Remember, the reason why they are taking slaves to the New World is because the Native American slaves would have been not the most effective because so many were dying off. Take a look at the very bottom of this map. It says from 1518 to 1850, about 11 million slaves were shipped from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. Of these, about 500,000, or just 5%, were imported to what we now call the United States. So that's kind of important because sometimes when we think about the United States, we do think about slavery as an issue. We do hear about slavery, but only 5% of all the slaves brought to the New World were brought to America. The rest would go to South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and would forever change these islands. Forever, because if you go to these islands now, if you go to Haiti, you're not going to find significant amount of Native Americans because they all died. But we're going to find nations like Haiti that are going to be a majority black population, totally different from what they were in 1491. Now also take a look at this map. You'll see that there were some slaves brought directly to Portugal, directly to England. We also see that there was what's called an Arab trans-Saharan slave route, where not just the Christian European world was practicing slavery, but also the Muslim world was taking slaves to the northern coast of Africa. Remember that in Islam, there is no prohibition against slavery. The Prophet Muhammad owned slaves. You're not to abuse a slave, but Islam has no problem with slavery in of itself. Now, remember that when the Spanish get to the New World, they find Aztecs that were engaged in incredibly bloody practices. For the Spanish, this is justification for them conquering and invading. Many Spanish say, hey, it is okay for us to go ahead and do this, to conquer. In fact, we are instruments in God's hand to bring judgment upon this nation that is engaged in these satanic practices. And in truth, if you saw these things yourself, you might be open to taking over or intervening militarily. One of the things is we will, as we look at the rest of this PowerPoint, we're going to identify the important differences in the colonial political institutions and economies created by Spain, Portugal, England, and France. We talked a little bit about those differences already. And here we go. This is the a map showing us the Spanish Empire in the dark brown. We also have the Portuguese. If you're looking where it says South America, there's this yellow map, and we see mining all throughout. And that's just really good to remember that so much of the Spanish world in the Americas was just producing mineral wealth. We talked about places like Potosi, which was here on the map. It lists Potosi in Bolivia as a major source of mining. And so that's all the Spanish are really doing. They're not going to develop the economies in a meaningful way. They're going to micromanage these colonies. And the Portuguese will also not get so much out of mining, but from growing sugar. But they're not the only players. In fact, in 1667, we have a map showing you the English colonies. This would be the 13 colonies. There will also be New France. So on your handout, it says differences with the Spanish and the Portuguese. Time frame, we'll write down the English and French colonies began about 100 years after the Spanish ones. The English and French colonies began about 100 years after the French, or rather after the Spanish ones. So England and France do come in, but they come in pretty late, about 100 years after Spain has already started its colonies. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that England, you might remember, and much of the Protestant world were engaged in these so-called wars of religion. Remember that the Protestant Reformation hit Germany pretty hard. There was issues in England about the identity of England being Anglican, going through a civil war itself they would have in England. France with the fighting between the Huguenots, those so-called French Calvinists in government. There was a lot of fighting and sorting out that had to be done. And because of that, England and France are going to be a little bit behind colonization. And when they do get to the New World, they find a part of the New World very different than what they may have hoped to have found. Now, for the political framework, we're going to write two things. We'll write down that France and England were more hands-off. They were more hands-off. And we'll also write down that private companies took the lead. And what I mean by more hands-off was that one of the things you should remember about Spain and Portugal is they really micromanaged the colonies. They were in the business of the colonies. They wanted to have viceroys and other officials that dictated everything that the Spanish and the Portuguese could do. But not so with England and France. England and France had more of the idea that, hey, if you want to go do these colonies, that's cool. You go out on the colonies and you're going to be able to have a lot of political and economic experimentation. We're not going to micromanage you. You're going to be on your own, and that's going to have some freedoms. In fact, there was not the government itself that started a lot of these colonies, but private companies like the Virginia Company took a risk and said, we're going to go out and see what we can find. And one of the things that they wanted to see what they could find, in fact, where it says English hopes, they really wanted to find gold and silver. They were hoping that they would find the same things that the Spanish found. They were hoping that they would find, easy resources to be taken from the New World, easy sources of gold, easy sources of silver, easy sources of mining wealth to return home with, and they wouldn't find that. So here again, the differences. Well, one of the differences that we just talked about was that there is no easy gold, there is no easy silver, and the political framework, because the English are there on their own without Spain, without their mother country micromanaging them, we're actually going to see early examples of democracy in the New World, in the English colonies, but not in the Spanish colonies. The English, they were hoping to find gold. They were hoping that they would be able to produce high-value products like citrus or even making silk. They did find some wealth in raiding Spanish ships. So for the English, if they couldn't make money finding easy gold, what some Englishmen did do was attack Spanish ships that were loaded with gold and silver heading back to Spain. And so we see the rise of piracy even at this time. So like all those movies like Pirates of the Caribbean, why would there be pirates in the Caribbean? They'd be attacking Spanish ships, trying to get easy money as these ships would be returning back home. One of the early examples of an English settler is this gentleman, Sir Walter Raleigh. And where it says Roanoke, we'll write down an early English settlement. Where it says Roanoke was an early English settlement, and where it says Sir Walter Raleigh, he was given permission from the Queen in fact, Queen Elizabeth, to go ahead and start this colony. It's important to remember that there was Henry VIII. You might remember Henry VIII was the king that started the Anglican Church. Remember that he broke with Rome, not just because he wanted his marriage dissolved, but also he wanted to control English institutions. He wanted there to be no rival institution for him, Henry VIII. And he did get the marriage that he wanted, but his marriages produced a couple of different children. Ultimately, Queen Elizabeth would be the one who would take the throne, and she would be a Protestant, a very strong Protestant. And this would cause some conflict in England, as some people still wanted to hold on to a Catholic identity. It caused some issues in that Elizabeth was a woman, and some people felt that a woman may not make the best leader that you can have, but Elizabeth would be an incredible leader and a very long-lasting leader. And one of the things Elizabeth would do is give permission and sought to develop and strengthen the role of England in the world, including colonizing the New World. And so she gives permission to Sir Walter Raleigh to do this work. And one of the first places that they do settle is this Roanoke Island. Virginia Dare, on the handout in 1587, was the first European born in the New World. And when I mean European, I mean an English speaking person born in the New World. There obviously were Spaniards that were having their children in the New World at this time, producing the so-called Creoles. But this is the first example of a European born to English parents in America, Virginia Dare. And we're not actually really sure what happened to Roanoke Island. In fact, sometimes it's called the Lost Colony. We know that there were some 90 men, 17 women, 11 children. And when they returned to bring supplies the next year, there was very little evidence of the existence of the colony. The words CRO were the only words inscribed on a nearby tree, and people believe that maybe they made reference to the Croatoan natives, that maybe they had attacked, or maybe those Native Americans had brought them in because the white Europeans didn't really know how to live off the land. In truth, we don't know what happened to them, but it was a failure. Now let's go to the next line where it says Ireland as a model. We'll write down Ireland on your handout. It says Ireland as. We'll write down Ireland as a model. So as England is deciding to flex its political muscles and they're deciding to expand and become more powerful, one of the things that they're going to look to is conquering the areas right next to England. England conquers Scotland to the north, and just to the northwest of England is the island of Ireland. And the English choose to go ahead and conquer and invade it. In fact, here on this slide, it says Ireland had been invaded by the English, and the English cleared Ireland of the natives in 1566. They had taken over the island of Ireland from the Irish, and here on this slide it says in 1650, 150,000 English had moved to Ireland and basically had taken over the land from the people that were there. And even though the Irish were fellow white Europeans, there was a difference between the Irish and the English. The English were Anglican, the English were Protestant, and the Irish were then and today Catholic. And this division of Catholic and Protestant is enough to give justification in the mind of the English that it's okay to conquer fellow white Europeans. On the handout it says in 1641, 59% of the land was owned by Catholics. Catholics owned 59% of the land in 1641. But look what happens as we continue in history. It goes to 1660. Catholics only owned 22% of the land. Why? What's happening to these Catholics who are Irish owning their own land, their own nation, their own island? It's been taken away by the English who have invaded, all the way down to 1776, the year that the American colonists rise up because they feel that there should be no taxation without representation. What's happening in nearby Ireland, right by England? In 1776, only 5% of Ireland was owned by the Irish, by those Catholic Irish. They were prisoners in their own island. They were an occupied people. And you can understand why to confuse an Irish person with an English person might arouse some upset feelings from an Irishman, because the Irish have been a people conquered, a people invaded, a people whose land was taken away. And if they can do that to the Irish, surely they can do it to other places of the world, and they will. In fact, here it says there were 6 times the number of English colonizing Ireland than those who had been sent to New England. But the idea of colonization, moving to a new land, taking the land and claiming it as your own, not a new thing. Here, this shows you the difference. It says the effect of Cromwell on land ownership. Remember, we talked about Oliver Cromwell, that after the English Civil War, he had taken over as the Puritan dictator. And if you're a Puritan dictator, you know what you might want to do to Ireland, which is not Puritan, not Protestant at all, but Catholic. You might want to go ahead and expand your influence, taking land away from the Catholics and putting it into the hands of Protestants. Now, on the handout, moving down to the south, let's go ahead and look at some general characteristics of 3 different regions. First, we'll look at English colonies in the south. Then we'll look at the English colonies in New England. And finally, the English colonies in the Mid-Atlantic. First of all, the South. The most important colony that we have in the South is the Virginia Company and Jamestown. We'll write down it was built on a swamp. And even though they think, hey, this is a great site, you have the James River on one side, you have swamps on the other, in the minds of the English who put Jamestown here, they think this is an easily defensible spot. And in truth, it probably was an easily defensible spot. But you can defend yourselves from Native Americans all day long, but if you can't defend yourself from the diseases that you might be exposing yourself to, that's another issue. You might remember diseases like malaria. Well, that's a real problem. Diseases living along a swamp, diseases that you can, be exposed to living in an area that you're not used to. Well, that's going to be one of the factors that resulted in the death of 80% of the population of Jamestown. And this just shows you that the English experiments, when they show up, it's not easy. It's not instant success, not instant victories. In fact, on your handout, it shows that there's no easy wealth. You're not going to just get rich by showing up to America. And this also highlights some of the differences that we're going to see between the English colonies and the Spanish colonies, is that they would eventually see profits on your handout from a product that they'll grow in the South. It's not going to be sugarcane. And it is going to be something addictive. It's going to be from tobacco. So ultimately, profits will be seen from tobacco. And in comparison to New Spain, the English colonists in the South were more rural than the Spanish colonies. It was more rural than the Spanish colonies. If you think about the Spanish colonies, they had big urban centers, cities like Tenochtitlan that had 100,000 people, bigger than London at the time, and Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, big cities. Well, not so in the American South. It's going to be more rural, more farming, more about agriculture as the source of wealth. So it's going to be really different in the American South. Here's another image of Jamestown, very easily defended, but horrible location, and as a result, the death and disease that followed. Tobacco is going to be the main cash crop that we're going to see, highly addictive. This is going to be an example of an item from the Columbian Exchange. Remember, the Columbian Exchange is the title that we refer to, the exchange of goods, ideas, and diseases between the Old and New World. No European had ever smoked tobacco before 1492, and it is a Native American product that the Native Americans use. It grows well in the American South and still does to this day, sent to Europe where people get hooked on it pretty quickly. Now, one of the things we need to talk about is who's going to work these farms and these fields. Well, we see in the South initially something called indentured servants or indentured servitude. These were, on your handout, primarily poor white Europeans. So the deal is you're poor and you're a white European living in England and you want a better hope for a new life, new opportunities, and you don't have a way to get to the new world. Well, what you would do is you would sign a document and you would say, listen, I promise I'm going to work for you for 4 to 7 years. And after 4 to 7 years, I will have my freedom. But during those 4 to 7 years, I am basically your servant. I will go without meaningful pay. I will do what you need me to do. And these are going to be the original workers who will move to the American South. The American South are going to have tons of indentured servants. These are poor Europeans, poor white Europeans that are going to make up in the American South, these indentured servants will make up some 80% of all the people that go there. And because these people have no economic future, most of these people are young men, and most of them are unmarried, because it's not likely some married woman's going to hitch her future to a man who has nothing to offer economically. And so these are single men that move to the Americas in quite high numbers, some 80% of them. In fact, on the next line where it says men in Virginia 1625, 84% of Virginia in 1625 was male. So can you imagine, that's not a successful recipe for a healthy colony. You need a 50-50% balance between male and female. But not a lot of women were saying, hey, sign me up to go to Virginia where I might get a disease in the middle of the swamp as we try to raise tobacco, and there is no easy wealth. Not a lot of women signed up for that kind of life, 84% male. And initially, it was a better investment than slaves. Initially, it seemed like this was the way to go, but we're going to see a shift, a change over time. In fact, on the handout, the change in slave population, in 1660, there was only 950 slaves in the American English South, but that 950 slaves would grow through constant importation of slaves. By 1756, the number had grown to 120,000 slaves. So huge change over time. Now, again, labor systems. Remember that New Spain relied upon the encomienda and the mita. This was basically forced labor of the Native Americans, and they worked on bringing in African slaves. But a big difference, something to notice, something I'm pointing out, is that the American English South used indentured servants, poor white Europeans. We have not seen that with the Portuguese colonies, and we have not seen that with the Spanish colonies. That is a difference. The English, again, use indentured servants. This is something we've not seen before. These were white. They paid, by being an indentured servant, this pays your way to the New World, and that way you can start a new life even if you can't afford that new life right away. And that was 80% of all the settlers. 4 to 7 years, and then you're out. Some 1,500 settlers came every year to the New World this way, mainly men and mainly single. And initially, this was the cheaper way to go other than bringing in slaves that may not survive. Now, the problem was with these English colonies, the healthier the colony got, the more established they had and had clean drinking water, the more they realized that the slaves could actually live and not die off. And if the slaves can live and not die off, it then became cheaper to actually own the slaves, and people said, well, we're not going to do the indentured servitude thing anymore, and that's when we see a slave culture develop in the American South. And again, looking at these numbers that we just talked about, 1660 we had 950 slaves, 1756 goes up to 120,000. And here's some documents that would be drawn up as mainly these single white poor males would sign these documents, getting them a trip to the New World. And taking a look at what the colonies look like, the colonies looked a lot different than what we see today. If you look at Virginia, Virginia goes from Jamestown all the way to the Mississippi. Look at North Carolina. It goes from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi. Or look at South Carolina, even all the way to the Mississippi. So a little bit different than what we notice and look at today. Just more demonstrations of what these early colonies, at least what the land that they claimed, looked like. Let's go to democratic experimentation, and the best example we have is the House of Burgesses, and this is another big difference between the English colonies and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese. The English colonies, where it says democratic experimentation, with the House of Burgesses, had representational government. They allowed people to gather, they allowed people to make votes, and by people I mean typically property-owning males who were white. But still, this is something that we have not seen elsewhere. We have not seen before. Spain and Portugal micromanage, had total control, but in the American South, we see the beginnings of democracy. And we shouldn't be surprised, because they had democratic traditions in England with the signing of the Magna Carta, with the signing of the English Bill of Rights, with the existence of Parliament. England had all of the preconditions for democracy, and we see that carry on over to the New World. Spain has nothing like that. Portugal has nothing like that, and so democracy only begins in these English colonies. Next, let's go to talk briefly about a special case of South Carolina, which we will write down had an African majority. So many slaves were brought into South Carolina that the average person was black. And this is very much like Brazil, when we saw Brazil had like 3 slaves for every 1 white person. And we even see a unique form of English develop called Gullah, which is English with African roots. English with African roots. And we'll talk a little bit more about some phrases and what their phrases mean when we meet together in class time. Now, finally, as we finish up talking about the American South, with all of these new people coming over from Africa, they're bringing their African languages, they're bringing their African cultures, and their desire for freedom is going to come along those boats with them. And one of the things that many slave owners would want to do is separate different Africans, because we're talking about different tribes that would come over. You might remember that some Africans would speak one language or be one tribe, and they might not understand all other languages, or other tribal groups' cultures might be different. So the English would not want the same tribal groups together. They'd want to split them up so they couldn't communicate and plan and look at a rebellion, because when rebellions happen, that becomes a really dangerous thing for a white minority who is outnumbered by their black slaves. One of the things that we see famously is what's called the Stono Rebellion, and this was an unsuccessful slave rebellion. This led to 40 whites being killed, and they were led by these African slaves, we think probably from Congo, who were Catholic. You might remember Congo was like one of the few places in Africa that accepted Catholicism. And after this rebellion, it freaked out the English that they really wanted to crack down on certain laws to make sure that would never happen again. One thing here on this particular map, it shows you an area that we've talked about before, which is like the fur trade. And that's going to be a huge, huge, huge deal in generating wealth, because there may not be gold and there may not be silver, but fur would be something that is going to be a money-making advantage of the New World. Exotic furs, things and animals that had not been seen before. In fact, from 1550 to 1850, we see furs became high fashion. Beaver hats became something that was very desirable, which is what this woman is wearing here, a beaver hat, things you don't think about today, but at this time that was like the height of fashion. In fact, these are all different types of hats that were made from the beaver, and this was something that people were willing to pay high money for, and so this is something else that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Furs, this is a little bit, and on your handout we can write this right below Stono Rebellion, where we can write down the term furs and write down in Carolina. The Carolinas did produce a lot of furs. In fact, looking at this, 100,000 deerskin a year. Huge, huge changes. Whenever you think you can just draw upon the environment without thinking about what would happen next, there's huge consequences, ecological damage, changing of the environment. And so make sure you write that right below Stono Rebellion, that the Carolinas produced major sources of fur. This would be a threat to the French. We'll talk about how the French were really, really interested in fur production. North Carolina, a couple more things we'll talk about before we move to New England. That they had forestry and tobacco. Slavery was slow. We talked about that already, how indentured and servitudes came first. South Carolina, a little bit more about that. It was founded by planters from Barbados. Barbados is an island in the Caribbean, and they brought in the idea of having slaves. And because they bring in having these ideas of having slaves, the culture of South Carolina is going to be like the culture of Brazil, slave majority, white minority. And they are bringing their influences, and even with the names they pick, if you think about Virginia, Virginia is named after Queen Elizabeth II. Well, Elizabeth and Virginia, that's not the same. Well, Elizabeth was the Queen of England who never chose to get married. And because she never got married, she actually had a nickname. She was called the Virgin Queen. And hence we get Virginia. Here's the Stono Rebellion, a big, big, scary thing for Europeans. Freaked them out. They said, we really need to make sure that blacks don't get guns, because when they get guns, bad things happen. This is a big difference between European slavery and Islamic slavery. That was okay for slaves to be part of the army. So let's talk about New England. Groups who came to New England came for radically different reasons. People who went to the American South came for, economic opportunities, for like a second chance. People that came to the South were indentured servitudes. They were mainly poor. 80% of them were men. They were not married. They were single. Well, what about New England? Well, they weren't people that were like that at all. People that came to New England were often very wealthy. In fact, they came for religious freedom. Of the two groups that came for religious freedom were Calvinist groups. Remember, Calvinism is this certain type of Christianity that stresses the absolute power of God, to the point that they would argue that God has predestined some to go to heaven and some to go to hell, and there's no meaningful free will for you to change what God has decided. And the two main Calvinist groups sought freedom from the problems of the state-sponsored Anglican Church. Remember, the Anglican Church is a Protestant church, but some people thought it's not Protestant enough. It's a little bit too much like the Catholic Church. And so the two groups we'll talk about on your handout were the Pilgrims. We'll write down that they wanted a complete break with the Anglican Church. The Pilgrims wanted a complete break with the Anglican Church. They thought the Anglican Church is too corrupt, it's too messed up, that you can't save it. We need to break off from it, separate ourselves from it, and that's why they're also sometimes called the separatists, the Pilgrims. And we also have another group of Calvinists called the Puritans, who felt that you could bring meaningful change within the Anglican Church, that you could purify it of those Catholic influences, which is what they thought was like the source of all evil, basically not being Protestant enough. Now, the types of people who came over, deeply religious, the Pilgrim story that we think about with Thanksgiving, when they come over the boats, they're about reading the Bible, having worship, having prayer, seeking God's will. The Pilgrims, as we mentioned on your handout, they wanted this complete break with the church. About 100 of them came to America in 1620. They start off this colony of Plymouth, and they tried to base Plymouth based on biblical principles. In fact, when we think about the content of the Mayflower Content, it is rich with biblical principles. It starts off, this is the Mayflower Content Pact. It says, in the name of God, we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Britain and France and Ireland. Listen how they describe the king: defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. All this language is talking about that they want to do it for king and country. They want to do it to spread the Christian faith. That's what these people believe. That's what these people were hoping to do in America, to bring Christianity and to have the freedom to worship the way they desired. And we have the whole first Thanksgiving thing. It's awesome. And here we see the Massachusetts Bay colonies as they're developing here in the. And these families that came on the handout, we'll write down, it was made up of mainly wealthy families. We're not going to see a lot of single people. We're not going to see a lot of poor people. If you can afford to get on a boat, not for a new job, but for freedom of religion, it's likely that you're a very wealthy person. And we don't see a lot of single individuals. We see wealthy families, husbands, wives, 3, 4 kids, even servants. This is how New England is different from the other colonies. Incredibly wealthy, purposefully there for religious freedom. Not a lot of single people. We see an even 50-50 of the division of the sexes. So very different. But we also see a similarity in that we also see elected representatives form here in New England. Again, a big difference between England and their colonies, and Spain and theirs. The economy, one of the things you're going to notice about Massachusetts and Maine, it's way too cold and way too rocky to grow tobacco and things like that and make a profit off of it. So 3 sources of the economy, we'll write down fur, timber, and fish. And some of the richest fishing grounds in the planet are right off the North Atlantic. Fur again, timber again, these are raw products that they will send back home. Remember, the term mercantilism is about the fact that these colonies exist just for the betterment and the enriching of the mother country. Because they don't have massive amounts of farming, it's too cold and too rocky, slavery and farming was minimal. And so here's another big difference. In the South, we have slaves being the majority in places like the Carolinas. But here, you're going to find very few, if any, black slaves at all. Some people in the North would never even see a black person in their entire life. So mainly white, wealthy, and Protestant. White, wealthy, and Protestant. Particularly Calvinist. So again, just to review, the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, not break away. The Puritans had no priests, no bishops. They believed that those words are not necessarily clear biblical principles, so they didn't do that, and they had some 20,000 by 1643 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Some early leaders to know, John Winthrop, and you can actually write this down next to the line with the Puritans. Just write down John Winthrop. He was an early leader, and he believed in the union of church and state. He didn't believe that church and state should be separated necessarily. In fact, he says that we would consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we've undertaken, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. We shall open the mouth of the enemies to speak evil of the ways of God. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we, being consumed out of the good land, whither we are going. In other words, he's saying that, listen, if we do right, God's going to bless us. We'll be a city upon a hill that everyone will look at and say, wow, this is what happens when people follow the Bible. And if we don't, God's going to punish us, and everyone's going to look at us and say, oh, I guess they weren't serious, and maybe their God isn't serious. So they were very interested in being a city on a hill, an example for other people to clearly see and follow. We do hear things like the Salem witch trials. These children say that they had these visions. People are accused. We do know witch trials were common at the time period. The death penalty was unusual, and these Salem witch trials were unusual as well. But people got this paranoia and began accusing all these different people of being a witch. In fact, people would fall down on the floor. People would have spasms. They would say, oh, this one person made me do that. In total, the trials resulted in the execution of some 20 people, 14 women, 6 men, and the imprisonment of 175 to 200 people. A horrible, horrible time in American history for sure. This is now going to talk a little bit about the mid-Atlantic colonies, which include New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Here is New York, state of New York, and we're going to see the mid-Atlantic very, very different than the rest of these American colonies. This is a part of New York. In fact, all these in color are parts of the city of New York City. You might know that New York City is not divided up in neighborhoods necessarily, as it's divided up in what's called boroughs. We have Staten Island, we have Queens, we have Brooklyn, we have the Bronx, and we have, number 1 on this map, Manhattan Island, which is considered by many to be the most important part of New York. In fact, on the handout where it says New Amsterdam, in parentheses says Manhattan Island, it was purchased from Native Americans for $1,000. These were from $1,000 of beads and other items of very low cost wealth. But for $1,000 is what the Dutch actually purchased Manhattan Island, all of number 1, from the Native Americans for, which is pretty crazy because today all of Manhattan Island bought for $1,000 is some of the most expensive property on the planet. This again is Manhattan Island in yellow, and this is it in the early 2000s, before obviously 2001 when the World Trade Center, which is pictured here, had not been hit in the 9/11 event. This is looking at Manhattan Island, some of the most expensive property in the United States today. A deal for $1,000 back then for the Dutch. In the middle of Manhattan Island is one of the largest parks in an urban setting. This is Central Park because it's in the center of the island. And here's another view from the other side, and you can see how large this park is, wooded with lakes and trees and bridges. You know, one of the most important parks in the United States. Now, one of the things that happens in these mid-Atlantic states is we'll see that they're very ethnically diverse. We'll see that in a minute. And New Amsterdam started off as a Dutch island. In 1664, it was taken by the English. The English showed up with an army, and the Dutch surrendered without a fight. And with it being taken over in 1664, New Amsterdam gets a new name, and now that they're ruled by the English, they take the name of New York. And it was very, very diverse, where it says nationalities. We had Dutch living in New York, Germans, Swedes, slaves, and now the English. And just like New York is today, multi-ethnic, it started off that way, and not much has changed. Let's now talk about Pennsylvania. It was started by William Penn in 1682, and it started as a Quaker colony, which is a denomination of Christianity that stressed sometimes nonviolence. In fact, Philadelphia, which means the city of brotherly love, would become the largest English-speaking cities in the New World. Philadelphia, even that name, which means city of brotherly love, comes from that Quaker heritage, stress on non-war and, cooperation. In fact, that principle of negotiation, not war, comes from that Quaker influence. And so they do have farming in the Mid-Atlantic, but it's important to write down, but it was a free workforce. It was a free workforce. They don't have a lot of slaves. In fact, it says, unlike the Carolinas, they had free labor, mainly Germans who worked there. And they frowned upon slavery. And the Atlantic are one of the most ethnically diverse of all the colonies that exist. In fact, we see that with all these different groups coming in from different parts of Europe. Finally, let's talk about New France, and we'll be done. Everything in blue was New France. Newfoundland and the St. Lawrence River was the main source of the French settlements. The St. Lawrence River is what flows from the Great Lakes out into the basically like into the access to the North Atlantic. And this is where the French are going to go. And they're here not to build cities, and they definitely don't find gold or silver, but they are there for fur. And the word on your handout, coureurs de bois, this literally means runners of the woods. These were Frenchmen who traded with natives and even intermarried with natives. And here's an important point to point out, is that this is something the English don't do commonly. The English have their 13 colonies, and it's mainly whites marrying whites, very little intermarriage. The Spanish had a lot of intermarriage, the Portuguese had a lot of intermarriage, and the French also intermarry. Negative impact of the French coming in, well, they bring guns and alcohol, that they do trade with tribes that are willing to work with them. But as they introduce guns and alcohol, some Native American tribes turn on other Native American tribes, causing an increase in violence in the New World, fueled by French guns and French alcohol. A couple things that we do see. We see there, because the French don't have a lot of people living in the New World, they have to work with Native Americans like the Mohawk Native Americans and the Seneca. In fact, there's these 5 nations called the Iroquois Confederation, a powerful group of Native Americans working together that the French would hook up with, and they would trade with, and they'd give guns and money with. And the reason they had to work with the Native Americans is they were simply outnumbered and needed to if they wanted to be successful in the New World. One of the things that they did as they established New France is they did send out not just traders, not just some soldiers, but they sent out a lot of missionaries as well in New France. These missionaries and these traders would try to adapt to the conditions they found, dressing in very unconventional ways, going in places where few other white people would go. They would take on beards and the dress and wearing buckskin clothing, much like the Native Americans, and earn the respect of the Native Americans they found. going to these places, including the Jesuits, who sought to convert many of the native peoples that they found. They even, because the Jesuits are the most educated of the Catholics of the time, would learn Native American languages, even create alphabets for Native American languages where there had not been any, translated the Bible into expressions and phrases they can understand. Despite these successes, New France on your handout had such a small population. They only had 7,000 people living in all of New France. So if you think of that huge map of France from New Orleans all the way to Canada, only 7,000 white people. So for the handout, French and the natives, they were very hands-off with the native population. You can't conquer and destroy all the Native Americans from Canada to New Orleans if you only have 7,000 white people there. They were very hands-off. They saw the natives as trading partners, not people to be conquered and destroyed. They were not people to be assimilated or wiped off. They were people to help you find sources of trade and wealth. In fact, just to highlight the low level of population, all of Louisiana in 1708 had only 300 white people living in it. And this empire, unfortunately, would be short-lived. There's the famous 7 Years' War, sometimes called the French and Indian War, that England and France would fight. And in this war, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, that would have the English on one side or the British on one side and the French on the other, the French would lose. And by losing the French and Indian War, the French would lose all of Canada, and the French would lose Louisiana. And so the French Empire in America would be a short-lived one, and it would be a war that would forever move the weight and balance of power in favor of the British that would come to dominate the New World from this point on. The French impact had been a short-lived one, but an important one. And as the French lost Canada, thousands of French speakers left Canada and moved to New Orleans, moved to Louisiana, which is why we have, even to this day, French-speaking influence there. The refugees from the north moving away from French Canada and moving to Louisiana. That being said, we still have French speakers today all throughout Quebec, the part of Canada that some want to rebel and want to be independent to this day. But with the 7 Years' War, this French and Indian War, all of Canada would be lost to the English and forever change the balance of power.